I want to introduce to you the Bagatelle model of specific learning differences. The old deficit model of dyslexia and dyspraxia and other specific learning difficulties has this idea that each of these things is something that is wrong with somebody, that it has an identifiable cause even though nobody's found one yet, and that each of them appear to overlap in mysterious ways, but they're discrete and that they can be fixed. And the deficit model identifies people on the basis of their difficulties. And then, in response to that, they attempt to remediate those difficulties. So, for example, if you're dyslexic and you have difficulty with phonological awareness, then they will attempt to fix that, to remediate it, and by giving you lots of phonics practice and so on. And I argue that that's actually a big mistake. The Bagatelle model is based on the game, where you have like a ball bearing or marble, and it's fired up into the maze of pins and holes and slots, and it bounces around until it arrives in a particular hole or a particular slot. Now we can use that as an analogy of human beings. We need to make it a little more complex, so instead of there being one ball, let's imagine there's a few that all fired up together. And let's imagine that rather than a two-dimensional maze of pins, we've got a three-dimensional maze of pins. But essentially, the model is that the balls are fired up into the maze, and unlike ball bearings, of course, people react to the different experiences, some of which can be rather humiliating and painful and difficult. And the ball bearings end up in particular slots or holes. Now, the deficit model identifies dyslexia or dyspraxia by which combination of holes or slots that you end up in. And I'd say that's looking at the wrong end of the process. Let's imagine that some of us have a particular difference in these ball bearings or marbles, and they are fired up into the maze, and we bounce around and we're predisposed to end up into particular slots, but not predetermined. Now, what is this core difference? The core difference is a very strong preference, almost need, to process information holistically, to make sense of the big picture. Now, if you process information holistically, that depends on creativity, to map things and make connections. It relies very little on working memory. In contrast, if you prefer to process information sequentially, that relies heavily on a good working memory and very little on creativity. So we have this difference. We're fired into the maze, we're predisposed to end up in particular slots, and they'll say, okay, this slot, reading difficulty, phonological awareness difficulties, working memory difficulties, we'll call that dyslexia. Okay, working memory difficulties, difficulty coordinating muscles, clumsiness, we'll call that dyspraxia. Difficulty focusing on one thing at a time rather than everything, ADHD. And we can go on. Now, where you end up in these particular slots is a matter of chance, a matter of your experiences through life and how those affected you and how you perceived yourself as a result of them. And what I'm really saying is that all these specific learning differences have the same core difference. They're the same as each other. They end up in slightly different places but with lots of overlap. So we know, for example, if you get diagnosed as having ADHD, 50% of those people are also diagnosed as having dyslexia, 50% are also diagnosed as being dyspraxic, 29% are diagnosed as having Asperger's. These aren't small overlaps. These are significant overlaps, because really we're talking about fundamentally the same thing. We can also have the situation where someone is fired into the maze, fired into the bagatelle, with the same differences as me, but doesn't end up in exactly the same slots. And they're not diagnosed as having a specific learning difficulty. And other people land up in the same slots purely by coincidence. And they are diagnosed as being dyslexic or dyspraxic or ADHD, but actually they are not the same as me. They've got a range of different core differences. And I think if we need to understand specific learning differences, we need to understand the core differences and how through our lives we end up in particular slots and holes and traps.